she'll catch up. So Janet, I guess it's all you.
Okay. Todd, unless you wanted to kick anything off, I'm going to go ahead and just jump in.
Not at all. It's your show. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I am going to share my screen. And I will ask if anybody has double screens. If you raise your hand, I believe that actually on my screen you go to the top, but just anybody, if you can let me know if someone has questions that I am not addressing by raising their hand or something, I would appreciate that. I am going to just do a very brief introduction, and then we're going to be turning it over to the staff that handles the police services oversight and also fire services oversight. So with that, I'm going to kick this off. The first thing today, we're going to be talking about the follow-ups from the May 11th session, then talk about the police services and the fire services, and then any questions or comments that the council needs to have answered or questions. The next things that are upcoming in June are going to be the public hearing notice and then also the public hearing on June 24th. As you know, on June 24th, that's really actually the time that you're just adopting the budget and listening to any public testimony. However, if you have any questions between now and then, please don't hesitate to reach out to staff. Again, follow-ups from May 11th. If you remember, one of the questions was other cities comparisons, what other cities are looking at. This was actually, although we had what I'll call a verbal queue of other cities and comments they had made in the press, when taking on this exercise, it was actually interesting to see several things. So we're going to be looking at that briefly. Then we're going to show you the difference in the short-term rental revenue. That was a question that came up last time. And also then public safety, police services and fire services, as I mentioned. So other cities comparison, where they're going to be in the next year based on public information that's available to us. This is pretty much what we've heard kind of in the press. Some cities don't mention it. Some cities don't talk about it. But this is based on, like I said, their information. Interesting. Interesting that, let's see, I'm gonna drop my screen down so I can see. Ranch Mirage, Desert Hot Springs, Coachella, Indio, and Palm Desert are all anticipating that they may have a shortfall. Now, here's the other part of this that's interesting, is these are extraordinary revenues included in the general fund revenues. Now, this is interesting because if the cities did not have these extraordinary revenues, every single city would be expecting a shortfall. So if you look, the only two cities that don't have another extraordinary revenue is Palm Desert and Rancho Mirage. Indio, they have a sales use tax. They also have a utility tax, and they have a tax on the music festival services. La Quinta, sales tax. So when we talk about some of the cities here that are in the black, they have another type of revenue that is offsetting those numbers in the black. So I just share this with you because I think, as I said, it was interesting. I can't necessarily tell you that I could go into detail about what each of these cities charge and how it's based, but I can tell you that this is the information that is publicly available. So it is interesting to me. So it was a good exercise. Luis put this together for us, so we were able to see what other cities were doing. So if there's no questions, I'll kind of move on. Let me just make sure. I'm going to go down in my screen.
Hey, Janet.
Yes.
Just very quickly, and thank you. This is amazingly useful and comprehensive information. Thank you for that. The parcel tax in DHS, do you happen to know what the rate is per parcel? And if you don't, we'll move on. It's not important.
I do not. Luis, did you see that at all when you were looking at it?
I can probably find it. So if you give me an opportunity, I'll go through the documents that I have.
Don't go to too much trouble and don't do it now. If it's not too much trouble, you can do it in the next few days, week or so. I'm just interested. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Okay. So that was interesting. Then I wanted to share with you the change in short-term rental revenue. I went back to 17-18 and compiled the information. I kind of gave you a breakdown in two sections here. We have year-to-date March. I gave you some totals here. I'm gonna move. I gave you some totals here so that you can see the difference between what we anticipate 2021, or not anticipate, but what we've actually received in 2021 and the percent change. But I did go back to this year because 17-18 and 18-19 were the years that were full years. And if you recall, the short-term rental, I think, was banned in the R1 zone, wasn't into effect until December 31, 2019. So the other issue, and the reason I bring this up on this slide, is the question, I believe, was how the change has impacted our short-term rental revenue. The bottom line is it's very, very difficult to determine the difference. Lots of things happened, and as you can see, in the 1920 year, we had COVID. But if you look at the numbers for, say, January of 2020, and you look back, they're pretty consistent. There's just not a lot of change. But then in February, we know that there were issues with the virus, and we do see a little bit of a change here. And then, of course, in March, everything was shut down. So I prepared this. Some of the information we just don't have readily available to us. We have the total, but some of our platforms, such as Airbnb, they just pay us the amount and they don't provide detail. So we don't have detail to know whether those folks were affected, or how many they're paying us for versus how many they were paying before some of those changes in the ordinance occurred. As I said, I split this so you can see that from last year, we're down just a little bit. March was a very significant increase. So we're almost even for the year with last year, but to the prior year, we are lower. And then I gave you some analysis down here to show you where we are year to date, to the total in 17-18, the total in 18-19, and the total in 19-20. Again, overall for the year in 19-20 to 2021, we're only down 4%. But of course, this is for the full year in 19-20, and this is only through March. So if there's no questions on that, I will go to the next slide. And basically, that's really, as far as follow-ups, that's about all we had for follow-ups from the previous discussion. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions. And then the next thing we will do is go through the police budget. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I see Mayor Kelly has joined us. Now I can see because I stopped sharing, so I can see all the participants. But if anyone had any questions on those slides, obviously I can go back to them. And if not, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Mr. Aryan to talk about the police budget for the upcoming year.
Thank you. Does everyone see my screen? Great. So just like Janet said, thank you. And if at any time the City Council has questions, please feel free to stop me and ask. And for those watching from home that may not know, the city provides law enforcement services through a contract partnership with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Our current agreement with the county is for a 5-year term through June 30th, 2024. And before jumping into the numbers, I want to touch upon the department's successes throughout the year and also planned initiatives for the upcoming fiscal year. So this last year, as you know, has been challenging for many organizations, and the Sheriff's Department is no different.
Okay. You said to stop you if you have a question.
Yes.
I got here just in time to cause trouble. Major initiatives for 21 and 22. Could you say a bit more about this first bullet point? It's quite exciting. So I'd like to hear just a bit more about how that's to be rolled out.
Sure. Let me, you're talking about the feasibility of a community-based program? Mayor Kelly?
Yes, or if that information will come to us at.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I actually fast forwarded the slides a little bit, so it went out of order. So I was going to touch upon that in very shortly. I could touch upon it now.
Well, you can wait.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure at some point we'd hear.
Yes, sorry
more
about that. That was a slip of the hand.
Okay.
So before jumping into the numbers, I want to touch upon the department's successes throughout the year and also planned initiatives for the upcoming fiscal year. So as I mentioned, this year has been challenging, and especially with COVID-19 staffing impacts, the department has successfully addressed that through their regional policing model. They responded to a total of 23,900 service calls, of which 389 were priority 1 calls with an average 6-minute response time. And these are your more serious calls for service, and a 6-minute response time is within the 5 to 7 minute range of response time seen in other law enforcement agencies. They also hired and brought into service 3 new community service officer positions with the goal of relieving patrol deputies with certain tasks, thereby increasing proactive patrol time. Last year also saw the department responding to numerous protests without any significant incidents, with a quick mobilization of available resources if needed. And the police department, they're continuously looking at ways to enhance customer service and overall response, and they've met this challenge in several ways. For example, community service officers are now the first responder to non-injury traffic accidents to further lessen impact to patrol operations. Furthermore, Captain Agnoletto modified special enforcement team hours to provide better coverage during non-routine business hours, such as the evening and weekend, when we see somewhat of an increase in activity. Lastly, residents can now file a police report for most routine matters by calling the station directly, making it a much easier and customer-friendly process for our residents and the community. So staff also identified several major initiatives we'll be exploring next fiscal year. The first one, as you noted, Mayor Kelly, we'll be looking towards a collaborative approach in addressing community-wide issues, including homelessness and the impacts of transiency. One possible solution explored by staff is a problem-oriented policing team, or as we call it, a POP team, that can proactively solve issues in the community through creative and strategic methods. Along with law enforcement, the team could include representatives from CVAG, city staff, which includes code compliance, county social service teams, and the final key integral partner being the community itself that we serve. And we are looking at this, and nothing has been set. Once we have a better idea how this team will look and form, we will bring it towards the city council for their consideration.
Hey, Stephen.
Yes, sir.
Can I just suggest that you actively involve the Public Safety Commission in that process?
Yes, they will be as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other work that staff is undertaking will be to take a closer look at the responsibilities of community service officers and see if we can identify other tasks that are currently performed by patrol deputies that can be transferred to CSOs to further increase patrol proactive time. And lastly, as you know, we previously looked at a regional policing contract with La Quinta and Indian Wells and obtained a report from Matrix Consulting. Since that time, there has been new city managers in every city, and more importantly, service delivery models have changed too. Our city manager has tasked us to expand our initial study to explore alternative models for delivering police services. The city has historically looked at what we have in terms of existing services, and we're going to take a closer look at what we need and work with our neighboring communities and Matrix to do just that. And once that report is finalized, we'll be taking it through the Public Safety Commission and the City Council for consideration.
Sorry to interrupt again. That's been floating for literally years. It's been in process. When are we going to give this an up or down vote?
This is a different approach. What we looked at before was a regional policing model with independent contracts. This would be looking at the 3 cities collectively and seeing, let's say for hypothetical purposes, if they were to create a police department tomorrow, what does it look like? Take that model and price it accordingly with the sheriff's department to see what the numbers are. and then bring it forward.
Okay. Let me say very directly, that doesn't answer my question. It's been a long process, and initially we looked at all sorts of options. I'm not sure we got a full report on that. We did see some interim reports that showed economy of scale opportunities, shifting of responsibility, reduction of deputy hours, and so forth, with some tremendous potential for cost-saving opportunities. And here we are, still without a firm conclusion or recommendation. I guess what I'm asking you is, we're looking at alternatives that involve joining other cities. When do you anticipate that we will actually have a report from staff today that says, here's what we've come up with for your evaluation, for your decision?
Stephen, I'll answer that.
Sure.
We're probably looking sometime in the next 3 to 6 months. So I mean, one of the questions that I had when we were getting the report is, it was just initially a one-time reset of the base by, and that really doesn't answer the, I think I asked the staff and we had a meeting with La Quinta and Indian Wells to take a look at this and say, with the experts and the data that we have there, what kind of a policing staffing model do we think we need? Because we're continuing to be dictated to about what we need. And we reset the base once, and then at 5% clip a year, you're right back to where you started in 2 or 3 years. So the idea is if we went through a process as if the 3 cities were one city, there are still elimination of overhead, duplication of services occurring that was not looked at. And I wanted them to go through that process. La Quinta's on board, Indian Wells is on board, and that's a very different answer to the question, because we can then, with empirical data, trends from the last several years, go back to the county saying, this is the model we want priced in the level of service that we want in the unaccounted for time, rather than just simply saying, well, we've got a couple ideas on switching, traffic officers over to CSOs. So I'm hoping they're receptive to it, but it's really a question that we need answered to understand whether or not we've leaned out that administrative overhead as much as possible, because and instead can redirect those resources on the ground.
Great job. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Todd? Is there an update on Rancho Mirage? I think that last time we heard they were considering it, but had not made a determination.
We still need to reach out to Rancho Mirage. My understanding, and I'll defer to Stephen if I say anything wrong, please correct me, but my understanding is when the discussion came down to us possibly reducing the headcount, going to a different model, they were not interested in pursuing that conversation. In fact, they were adding officers at that time. And the way they fund their public safety is I understand it, through a kind of a community-wide community facilities district or something similar to that. And so we're in a little bit different situation here, where we don't have that ongoing stream spread over the base of our taxpayers to cover those costs. And I think once we get that initial draft back from Matrix, we very well should approach Rancho to see if they're interested in this. If they're not going to move the needle too much, but right now, as long as that first iteration was in place and we were looking at ways of cutting costs, they opted out. I do think it's a good idea to go back to them and let them know what we're doing and asking if they'd like to be part of this. I think it makes a lot of sense for them as well if they're interested.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so what you see here is a 5-year budget history, and the city manager this year is recommending next fiscal year is recommending no significant changes to police services. The proposed budget is approximately $20 million, which is about $500,000 increase from last year due to rising patrol and other contract rates. The majority of the budget, about 50%, is for your basic patrol services. Other contracts warrant personnel make up around 40% of that $20 million budget. And these are your special teams, such as your business district team, your motor officers, your school resource officers, your SET team, among others. And the remaining 10% of costs are for support services, which includes such items such as overtime, facility fees, fuel costs, maintenance, and the like.
Stephen, on this slide, I read that there's going to be a retroactive rate increase to July 1, 2020, I believe. The figures that we're looking at, are they the original budget for 2021, or is that adjusted for the retroactive increase?
Yeah, the budget for 2021-22 includes a retroactive patrol rate adjustment, and then they anticipate a adjustment for next year, which we added to this number. So those are included.
So both of those years are adjusted for the.
Yeah, we adjust the current rate. It was adjusted for this year to include that. It was the 197 patrol rate. And then we anticipate a 4% increase for next year, which is also included in this final figure.
Okay, thank you.
So this slide is a more informative staffing breakdown for the department. And the patrol full-time equivalent positions did see a slight drop. And that's because last year the sheriff implemented a new shift model, providing for 12-hour shifts. And this model allows for fewer deputies provide the same number of patrol hours. And what I'm saying is our patrol hours remain the same, but just with fewer full-time equivalent positions. The city has a total of 59 sworn positions overall, which comes out to 1.10 sworn positions per 1,000 residents. Are there any questions before I move on? And this slide shows,
Yes, yeah, I have a question. Can you go back and give me that math again?
the math for the sworn positions.
Yeah,
It's 1.10 sworn positions per 1,000 residents.
okay.
And how does that compare to neighboring cities?
I don't have that data, but I can find that data and get it to the council. I haven't researched that out yet, but that should be pretty easy to get.
Okay, and I have an additional question. You talked about the fact that we were maintaining the same number of hours of patrol, but with fewer full-time.
The full-time equivalents just saw a slight drop. Previously, you were looking at a total of 1,770 hours total per year per position. And with the new staffing, that they moved to a 84-hour pay period, which increased that hourly total to about 1,800, so about 100 more hours. So that caused your full-time equivalent positions to slightly decrease by about 2.
Okay, thank you.
And this slide shows the cost containment measures the City Council has approved over the last 5 years. As you can see, the majority of the measures were enacted this current fiscal year in response to pandemic-related economic impacts. The majority of cost containment comes from a modification of patrol hours, which, as you'll recall, we compensated by hiring 3 additional CSOs, community service officers, to increase patrol proactive time. And are there any questions on this slide before I move on? And before concluding my presentation, as Janet had pointed out, staff was requested to provide crime statistics for the city, which I'd like to show. Please note that the next few slides will be slightly out of order than what was provided in your packet earlier today, but the information is all the same. So this slide compares all 9 Coachella Valley communities FBI uniform crime report data for violent crime between 2014 and 2019. The final 2020 data is not yet available on their website, and it's typically updated in the fall. So violent crime totals include such crimes such as homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assaults. Palm Desert, along with other neighboring communities, experienced a violent crime increase in 2019, specifically with aggravated assaults. And an aggravated assault occurs when someone is attacked for the purpose of inflicting severe bodily injury. And just want to note that nationwide, aggravated assaults also increased in 2019, and they account for 60% of all violent crime in California. And here's the data broken down by population, with Palm Desert highlighted in yellow. Are there any questions before I move on? The next slide.
Yeah, Stephen, if you go back to the prior slide, it's very interesting. Which cities have an increase in violent crime and which have a decrease. And I wonder if any of our officers on the Zoom have an impression about why the variation, for example, with Palm Desert, Rancho Mirage, La Quinta going up and Desert Hot Springs going down.
I'm not sure if Lieutenant Bartello is on the, can be elevated. I did look at all the other cities' increases that do show an increase, and those two are all attributable to the aggravated assaults that I mentioned.
I'm not seeing him in the on the participants list, Stephen.
Well, I'll move on, and if he comes in later, just let me know and I'll stop and he can
I'm
provide.
so sorry that I was given a task to elevate people, but you're right, I don't see him either.
Okay.
We can always ask later.
Sure, we'll do. So this kind of is a better representation because it shows that data in reference to the population of each city. Because if you look at the previous slide, Indian Wells appears to be like completely crime-free, but when you look into relative to their population, they're similar to the city of Palm Desert in terms of the per thousand totals.
So we're just looking at a ratio here, and then where we looked before, where Desert Hot Springs had gone down, then
Yeah, this right here is your total
right.
crime, and this here is the crime relative to the total amount of the population of the community.
Okay, thank you.
It would be also interesting to ask Lieutenant Martello, and I believe La Quinta has been historically low in this category, and I'm just wondering if they're doing something we're not, or whether it's just, you know, it is what it is. Because I realize we're not dealing with huge numbers, so they can fluctuate, but it'd be interesting to know that.
So this chart shows property-related offenses, and these include arson, which really we get very few of, if any, burglary, larceny, theft, and motor vehicle theft. So in looking at our numbers for Palm Desert, approximately 75% of the 2019 property crimes in Palm Desert were categorized under larceny theft related. And some examples of this crime include shoplifting or any stolen property that is not taken by either force, violence, or fraud. And as you can see in the following slide here, the more retail oriented and well-off communities tend to have a higher level of property crime. And then I'm going to conclude with this slide. And we looked at over the last 5 years, traffic collision data for Palm Desert. And as you can see, it's remained relatively stable. The majority of traffic collisions that we have are non-injury related with only property damage. And fatal and severe injury collisions accounts for approximately 2.5% of all traffic collisions over the last 5 years. And this concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions. Thank you.
I'll just say briefly, thank you, Stephen, because I did request crime data and you supplied it in spades. Very informative. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Looks like Gina has a question.
Yeah, yes, Stephen, I was just going to, ask in terms of the slide you just showed about the petty theft in retail, do we have data on how much of that is homeless related? Because a lot of the police reports I read seems to be transient. It'll say transient person's name, stealing something from Albertson's grocery store type of thing.
Yeah, we looked at that same question, and previously the department didn't keep a record on if it was transient related or not. However, they have now are tracking that data, so we'll have a better idea within the coming year of what those numbers look like.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Quintanilla.
My question is in regards to a further breakdown of the budget. I've been asked by community members if there's a way to find out what our increased share of cost is from the, for example, lawsuits that go out to RSO, whether it be civil rights lawsuits or, for example, even insurance costs of like work comp. How much of that is what the city's increased costs are annually? As city manager mentioned, we're often told what we need to increase, but we would like a further breakdown of where all of the nickels and dimes are going, especially as we look to explore a shared services contract.
Yeah, I'm looking at the patrol rate, and I could find a slide here in a second here that kind of shows a little bit of that. But you look at the overall patrol rate, about 13% is what's called internal service fund, services, supplies, et cetera. And within that 13% of the 197, there is a rate for what you're referring to, lawsuit related, risk management, insurance related issues. We could get a more concrete number working with the county and present that to the council.
Perfect. I appreciate that.
Information requested.
Thank you.
Did someone stop my
Okay.
sharing of the screen? I forgot to do that. Thank you. I'll do that.
If does anyone have any more questions with regard to police services? If not, we will move on to fire, and I will ask my colleague Lori to share her screen and her presentation.
And council members, don't be shy if you have a question about just speaking up. We won't wait to be called on.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mayor. And as my colleagues have stated, sometimes it's a little difficult to see who's asking a question when you're doing a screen sharing presentation. So please stop me. So much as with the police services, the city obtains fire and EMS services through a contract with Riverside County. An additional layer for fire and EMS is that the county subsequently contracts with the state of California, CAL FIRE, for these services. So I will go into, okay. So with our fire suppression, rescue, and emergency medical services, we're going to highlight a few of the successes of the past year. They provided frontline healthcare response during the COVID crisis that included developing some new protocols, maintaining service levels. They responded to 8,600 calls for service, and that is counterintuitively less than in previous years. And there are a couple of factors that have to do with that. One is the governor's numerous stay-at-home orders, which meant that we had fewer visitors and seasonal residents, and traffic incidents were down, as you saw on Steve's last slide there. We also had some individuals who chose not to call 911 out of fear of visiting the ER. While the calls for service were down, the time it took to perform each of those calls went up. As I'm sure many of you remember, during the peak times of COVID, there were impacted hospitals that lengthened the time of making those calls. We've broken down the calls for service by station. As you have grown to expect, Station 71 remains significantly busier than our other stations for a number of reasons, which we have discussed previously, including increasing population in the area. They were featured on the National Good Morning America program for their COVID response, particularly in nursing homes, because we do have a lot of skilled nursing facilities and congregate care homes, and they were featured for their good work there. They developed internal COVID response mitigation measures, including creating a designated cleaning team using fire staff so that every time there was an exposure, which was frequent for them, they were able to save the city thousands in costs by doing that disinfection and cleaning themselves. They also had to implement an extensive staff contact tracing program. Another COVID-related success was that they developed and implemented a temporary triage system for a tiered COVID dispatch. This allowed for the efficient dispatch of equipment and personnel and faster response to critical medical emergencies. We upgraded equipment and staffing models for Station 71. Again, this was to increase efficiency in responding to concurrent calls, and that is when Station 71 receives a normal call for service, say at one of our skilled nursing facilities, and simultaneously there is a call for service perhaps from a traffic incident or a cardiac event at home, and that call has to be responded to by an additional unit. And so adding equipment and staffing to Station 71 helps us to keep that second call within the realm of response times that we would like to see for emergencies. The department continues to assess our response to inaccessible rescues on our local trails. We upgraded equipment, and the team produced a PSA video and brochure on safe hiking in Palm Desert, which features our chiefs at the base of the Bump and Grind Trail to bring home the need to be prepared to hike that trail. In 2000, and going back just a moment, this is something that we're newly able to track. It wasn't a designated call type before 2019. But in 2019, we had 157 rescues. In 2020, 158. This is something that we will continue to closely monitor, because these pictures still don't tell us the full picture, because sometimes these calls come in as cardiac events, and when the EMS arrives, the patient is high up on the trail. As I said, this is something that we will continue to monitor and find ways to track. Moving ahead to our
questions before you move to the next slide.
Of course.
Thank you, Lori. So you mentioned, if I understood you correctly, that response times were longer in 2020. And I didn't quite understand the explanation, because you mentioned hospitals, but isn't the response time from the minute a call comes in to the time that they show up at the residence or at the patient's place?
I should have been clearer, Sabby. You're right. So it made each call take longer because because the staff was at the hospital waiting to relieve their patient, and because then, so let's say that, for instance, Station 71 is transporting a patient to Eisenhower, and they're there for 30 minutes, and another call comes in, a piece of equipment that's further away is responding to that second call, and so that is impacting response times. But the general issue was the amount of time that they were spending unloading their passengers and dealing with the protocols for COVID.
Yeah, I get it.
Longer.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. Now I understand. And then my second question is on the response to inaccessible rescues. As I recall, we paid for an ATV, an all-terrain vehicle. Has that been deployed?
That is on its way now. I think it's actually, we've received it, and they are outfitting it and preparing to use it moving forward. So yes, we did. That's part of our upgraded equipment. We got some accessories for that. The other place that we hope to be able to use that ATV or UTV is when we return to events such as our 4th of July and that sort of thing, where we can get emergency personnel into the action, as it were. But yes, we did receive that vehicle. Thank you to the council for providing it to us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did anyone else have a question on the successes of our department? I see none. I'll move on. If I can get my cursor. Okay. So we have several initiatives for the coming year. A major undertaking will be conducting a feasibility study for the North Palm Desert Fire Station, assessing its timing and need. This is another area where we have contracted with a consultant, Matrix Consulting as well, a different team, a team that specializes in this type of study. That contract is underway, and we are already starting to provide them with some of the data that they will need to assess, to provide us with a report on the timing and the need for a 4th fire station in the northern area of the city. We are also planning and completing projects at the city's 3 fire stations to address what is really years of deferred maintenance. Some of those stations are decades old, and they are showing their wear. We are also simultaneously and connected, we are assessing and planning for restoration and some modernization of city-owned fire facilities. For example, when these facilities were built, it was a single gender fire department. And now we have a 2-gender fire department, and we hope to encourage more women to participate in fire services. And some of the changes, some of the modernization that we need to make in the stations is to address things like that. Other modernization projects that we might undertake would be the barracks and the way that the fire personnel, their sleeping quarters are, to make them more modern. And again, there are lessons learned from the pandemic, especially when you have people on the front lines, that we need to address going forward, so that if we have another pandemic or significant virus outbreak, that we will be prepared to protect not just the public, but the first responders who we depend on to serve us. And so that's some things that we'll be looking at in the coming year. We're going to review the current fee schedule for emergency medical services for cost recovery. That fee schedule was developed nearly 5 years ago, and so it's time for it to be looked at. Currently, about 60% of our calls for service are Medicare, which are paid at a low fixed reimbursement rate, but it may be worthwhile to look into some of the other calls, the remaining 30 or 40% of calls that may not be being charged the best rate that they could be, or the best fee that they could be, to cover the cost of providing those services. So we'll look into that. We're also exploring cost recovery options through auto insurance billing for traffic accidents where it's appropriate. And those would be limited, and we would definitely bring back a program to the council and make sure that this was something that you wanted to pursue. But it's something we're researching and getting the details on, getting the information on what that could look like before we bring it forward to you as an idea. And then we will be receiving and placing into service the new Cove Commission ladder truck, which you authorized and ordered in 2019. It arrived at the Ben Clark Training Center yesterday. And so it's starting its process of being outfitted to be deployed to our Station 33. And we are working with our colleagues in fire and with Thomas to see what we can do about making that a public event that our constituents can participate in. So moving along, we have a picture similar as we did with the Sheriff's Department. This is what your fire department staffing looks like, divided up by the 3 stations. This includes our new paramedic squad positions that we talked about, which is 4 positions, 2 individuals per shift. Are there any questions about the staffing of the fire services? I see none, so I'm moving on.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Quick question, if I can ask.
Sure.
What is the approximate ratio for residents for that?
You know what, I did not get that number, but I certainly can.
It looks like it's just over 1.
It's 1.1, I would
It's
say.
very similar to the police, because we have 59 sworn positions and 61 fire and EMS positions. So it's very close.
Perfect, thank you.
It's about 1.13, Lori.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So very similar. Okay, moving on to our next slide. So what you see here is a map of the incidents that our department responded to within the city limits for 2020. What we see here is that our department is responding to incidents in every corner of the city. So sorry about that. I am going to put my in a meeting. So what you see is that we have our fire services responding to incidents in every corner of the city, whether that be fire, hazmat, or medical. The only places where they aren't responding are the places that are currently not developed, but as we know, they're developing quickly. In conversations with my colleagues in planning and community and development services, they have multifamily projects that they're working with folks on, which are in the hundreds. And then they are also in the planning phases and in various states of permitting for hundreds of residential units in those planned developments out there. That is something, again, in the matrix study, we will be really taking a deep dive on to see what the timing is of those developments, including at Cal State, and the, likelihood of increased student housing and those sorts of things as we time development of our next fire station. Did anyone have a question on the map?
I have a little bit of a random question. What would be a good example of hazard response?
I have my chiefs in the waiting room if they want to jump in and answer that question. That's the one I don't know. You asked me the one I didn't study up on, Jan.
Oh,
I'm
I'm good.
gonna guess that that's the, toxic material in the middle of the street that has to be cleaned up, that kind of thing.
That's our hat. Yep, that's our hazmat. Sometimes
We
there's
have we have hazmat and we have hazard. That's why I'm
Right.
asking the question.
right. If Clay can elevate Chief Beverland, I'm sure he would be happy to answer. Chief White is
Chief
here.
White is on. Oops.
I am. Partner, you want to take this one or you want to call? Sure. Basically, the hazard category is a category that catches some of the things that just don't fall into some of the standard call types. Carbon monoxide alarms, for instance, would be one. Small, different things at residences like maybe a cooking fire or some things that wouldn't just get automatically fall right into the fire category or a medical category.
And Tabby, I think you had a question as well.
Thank you.
I did. Thank you, Lori. So this slide shows incidents within the city of Palm Desert, but our units also respond to incidents outside the city, and that is not shown here. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the chiefs and I were discussing this. We were fine tuning this presentation up until yesterday with, going through call data. And they do have some rough numbers on how often we respond to a neighboring city and how often a neighboring city responds to us. It's one of the things that we'll be really taking a deep dive into with Matrix and really slicing this data in different ways. I think Chief Beverland has a rough estimate if he'd like to share it with you. There are, of course, a lot of factors that come into play there because we work as a regional fire protective agency.
And I know that I'd be interested in understanding the delta. In other words, are we going out to neighboring cities a lot more than they're coming in to help us? Because if that's the case, then we can make adjustments for that. Or it might be the other way, or it might be even. So again, I don't want to add to anybody's burden, but if that's readily available, I would be interested. Thank you.
Is it something that we could give? I'll give Chief Beverland a chance to answer, but then also it may be something that we could, with a few more days, prepare a better map and include it in the Friday report. But I'll let Chief Beverland respond.
Yeah, so the particular study that we were looking at was the relationship between Rancho Mirage and Palm Desert and the call difference between the number of calls that Palm Desert runs into Rancho Mirage versus Rancho Mirage running into Palm Desert. Palm Desert roughly runs approximately 300 more calls than Rancho does into Palm Desert.
Have you looked at calls across the freeway into county?
Yes, sir. I don't have a statistic for you. It's significantly less than that.
Okay, well, again, I don't want to burden anyone, but at some point, if it becomes available, I would want to understand not just Rancho Mirage, but calls outside of our city and how that compares, wherever that is, and how that compares to aid that we receive from other units.
Absolutely. And Sabby, it is also one of the things that we're going to be really looking at with the matrix study and the 4th fire station is what can we anticipate that that fire station would respond to in the county, in Rancho Mirage, in Palm Desert, and what partnerships can we form with other agencies in that staffing model. So can we form a partnership with Rancho Mirage, the county, and the Agua Caliente, because that is also expanding its footprint and may have an impact on services in the northern part of our city. And that is something that we'll be studying in greater detail, but absolutely we can get you some more information.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Did anyone else have any questions about this? Sabby touched on the one point that I was going to make, which is that this represents calls inside of Palm Desert and not necessarily in the intra calls between our neighboring communities. Also keeping in mind that one of our ambulances is housed at Station 55 in Indian Wells, and it responds to this area here in Palm Desert Country Club and wherever it needs to respond to, but we do have an ambulance that is stationed in Indian Wells. Okay, as we continue to look at the fire services in more detail, some of the things that we've been challenged with the public safety is to do more data analysis. So we're getting into that. This slide here shows you some statistics from the last 5 years. This is the responses for each Palm Desert station for the last 5 years. As I mentioned earlier, we had about 8,600 calls for service in 2020, which is significantly less than in 2019. But I'm sure the chiefs will concur, as they have said to me, as we continue to open up and people return to a more normal lifestyle, so do the calls for service. And so they are seeing an uptick already, and we will continue to monitor that, because we are anticipating, if things go well and the economy opens up great and everyone rushes back to Palm Desert, that is good, because it will fill our coffers and it will also have an impact on our public safety services. So we'll keep an eye on that balance. The other thing that we're just starting to look at, and this is a very high level kind of rough and dirty analysis of the average time en route for our different pieces of equipment at our different stations. So we have here all of our equipment: engine 33, medic 33, truck 33 at station 33, the engine and medic at 67 and 71. And these are their average on route times for a call in their primary response area. And as you can see, over the years, this time is creeping up. The target for the target that Riverside County sets and CAL FIRE sets as an appropriate response time is 4 minutes. And so we're moving above that now. And so again, this is something that we're taking a deep dive into in the next year, really trying to understand what all the factors are that are contributing to that and how we should best mitigate it. I'm going to move on to another slide.
Sorry, can I just ask you on that very issue?
Sure.
And this is kind of maybe a silly question, but 67 is over on Mesa View.
Yes.
Yeah, and probably part of the reason it takes longer is it's kind of remote and maybe serves other areas. It's also not an especially high volume station.
Right.
Have we ever looked at replacing it, essentially moving it to another part of the city rather than just adding a station, eliminating the one on Mesa View and creating a new one where it might be more central and be closer to all of its calls?
So I have two answers, Sabby. One is that you and our city manager must have, you great minds think alike, because he asked us a similar question about why Mesa View had longer response time since it was the least busy station. And you are familiar with the area, so you knew it's basically distance. And some of it is, the chiefs and I were talking yesterday about this. Some of it is access. So some of those communities in that area have a lot of obstacles to getting in. You know, they have numerous gates and security, things like that, which makes the call take longer. And then also there are some narrow winding roads up there, you know, to get back into where some of those calls are. Your second question about moving the station, reevaluating, that is something that previous division chiefs and Steve and I have had, you know, casual conversations about, like, would it be better to just reorient all the stations, right? Would it be better to say, you know, do we need to move everything around? That's a huge undertaking, of course, you know, land, building buildings, all that sort of thing. It's not something that we've ever taken any kind of a serious look at, but it's certainly something we can start, you know, whiteboarding, you know, brainstorming at the very least. Is it even something that's feasible or makes sense? I don't know if there's land, you know, close enough in that area that would be available. I just don't have a lot of background information. It's an idea that has been floated but hasn't been explored at all.
Lori, we looked at it many years ago. I want to
Okay.
think back in 2005, we took a map of the city with the 2-mile response radius and looked at the most, obviously there's a lot better locations to be served if we could start fresh and put the fire stations in the best positions. The problem was the availability of land. You are correct. And that's something we could take a look at again and see if there are any other new options that present themselves, since it was about 15 years ago when we last looked at that.
And I think we would need at least 2 acres, right, for a station. We'll keep talking about it, Savvy. I mean, it's.
Yeah, and I don't mean to go beyond just a general comment about it, but I'm glad to hear it's maybe not top of mind, but somewhere on the mind, because, you know, the city changes from 15 years ago and before then. And, you know, there's always, I mean, if there's an underutilized station and we're in the process of building a new station, maybe the two can be consolidated. I don't know. I don't have that expertise. I'm just looking at the numbers and the location, response time, and maybe it is needed there. It's a small station. Maybe that's just fine. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just asking the question and happy to hear that it's at least kind of somewhere on the mind. So thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
I don't want us to lose the observation Lori shared that there is possibly a reason for the longer response times from this station that does not entail traveling long distances, but just entails the obstacles of the locations it serves.
Right. Some of those, as you know, some of those country clubs are pretty windy, for lack of a better word. Okay, my last statistical slide is just medical versus other calls. And again, this is not something that's new to us. It's something that we've talked about before. I don't know that we've talked about it in a budget meeting, but 86% of the calls for service are medical calls in the period that we're examining. That is in line. I was reading a few articles regionally and even got a hold of a statewide report that tends to be in line with what other communities are seeing. About 80% of their calls are medical. That's something that we'll continue to look at as we look at what other models are available, what other communities are doing, and as we study the size and location of our next fire station. And then, as I discussed earlier, we did an analysis of what the EMS cost recovery trips, the trips that involve a transport to the hospital, how that shakes out. And 60% is Medicare, 11% is Medicaid. But there is, you know, there's about 25-30% of the calls that we go on that are either direct pay, the person pays cash, or private insurance pays for it.
Lori, could I ask a question here?
Sure, of course.
Because the bill patient wedge and the private pay wedge confused me. Because I thought it was our policy not to bill individuals, but only to seek reimbursement from insurance, including Medicare and Medicaid.
That's true. That is true. But some individuals, even if they apparently, this surprised me. I was surprised. I got this data from Whitman, and I was surprised by the amount of private pay, the amount of people who decide to write a check. We don't pursue anyone. We write off quite a bit, especially with Medicare and Medicaid. But there is a contingent of folks in Palm Desert who simply write a check for the fee, even if their insurance is covering part of it. And the bill patient, I believe, and I'm going to ask Steve if he'll jump in if I'm wrong here, but I believe that bill patient is for people who are not Palm Desert residents.
That is correct. And not the way the program identifies a resident is if you're a resident of the Cove communities, Rancho Mirage, Indian Wells, Palm Desert, those residents are not balance billed. If you're a non-resident, then a bill, anything that the insurance does not pay is billed a non-resident. But if they do not pay us, we just write it off. There is no collections or any punitive measures taken on anybody.
Does that answer your question? Go ahead.
And something else, Mayor Kelly, that I would just like to note is something that we've seen in a different type of phenomenon, which we can talk to Whitman about, and that is people that pay when they receive the bill and submit their own request to insurance to pay it.
Yes.
Directly to them. We're seeing the back end of that where we see people have paid it and then they have been reimbursed by their insurance. And we're actually in the process of that and who we end up giving refunds to, because an insurance company will pay and a private pay will pay. And then we'll end up giving the refund. We have to authorize the refund from our side of it.
And then, Janet, do we have any statistics on how many of these patients are coming from the assisted living homes along Country Club, that whole area? And if there's been any communication with the nursing home staff themselves to determine the usage of calling 911?
So I want to answer. I'll let Janet or Steve answer if we have a breakdown on how many of those ambulance trips are from those facilities. I'm not sure that the data that we receive breaks it down that way, but I can tell you, and our chiefs are here, that they have taken a very proactive approach in meeting with each of our skilled nursing facility staff, and especially during COVID, and educating them and working with them. In fact, I would let them invite them to jump in if they'd like to share more with that. But I know over the last year, they have really, and probably the last year and a half, they've really reached out and tried to educate folks and modify what calls for service come in. And then with the tiered response, they were really able to prioritize calls so that if it is just an assist to lift someone or move someone, that doesn't have the same level of response as a cardiac call or something like that. And I would invite the chiefs to respond if they like to add more.
Hello. So Lori really hit a bunch of the big topics. With COVID, we were able to modify a bunch of our protocols and cut through a lot of the bureaucratic and the red tape that the regulatory agencies draw a box around the fire department. So we were able to modify our response algorithm. And so a couple of things we were able to do at our skilled nursing facilities, especially the ones that have the higher level of care, where there's a nurse, a doctor, or a physician's assistant. Instead of sending the fire engine and the ambulance, we were able to send just the ambulance. We were also able to do some other modifications, as well as some of the outreach. So my partner and I went to all of the skilled nursing facilities and developed algorithms and protocols on how we were going to keep spreading COVID throughout their facility, because once it took hold, it really devastated those facilities. So we came up with some ideas of, they would bring the patients out to us, and it was a very collaborative effort to get through those tough times. A couple of the other things that we were working on, like Lori had mentioned, is our tiered dispatching. So within that tiered dispatching now, we went to over 5,000 call types. So based off of the call type, we dispatched the closest and the most appropriate resource. And we did a lot of communication and a lot of outreach with the facilities on not abusing the 911 system and just being truthful with what the call type is. They knew that if they said it was chest pain, that we were coming lights and siren, and we'd be there in 4 minutes or less. Only having the 7 ambulances within our system, there's only so many 911 calls that we could process at any given time. So with working with our partners and all the skilled nursing facilities, we developed a lot of trust and just collaboration between the two. The call types were appropriate. We reduced our call volume substantially to those facilities. And we learned a tremendous amount from dealing with COVID. And we're really looking forward to working with the regulatory agencies and making some of these long-term policies and changes. You may have heard some of that before, that it is the facility's policy that they can't help somebody who's fallen. We broke through a lot of those barriers because of COVID, and it really kind of changed the game. And so we're really looking forward to continue to work with all of those facilities and make some long-term change.
Thank you, Chief White.
That is really good news to hear. That is encouraging.
Did anyone else have any other questions or discussions just about the statistics before we jump into the financial aspects of our fire services?
I'm still a little bit fuzzy about what the difference is between the green wedge and the blue wedge.
So the blue wedge is that they're billing patients that are not residents of the city of Palm Desert. And if you're not a resident, or I shouldn't say city of Palm Desert, as Steve pointed out, a resident of the Cove Commission, of the Cove communities, which would be Indian Wells, Rancho Mirage, or Palm Desert. People who are not residents of that area do receive a bill. We write off the balance that they don't pay, but they do receive a bill. And then the private pay is a combination of what Janet was talking about, people who pay and then submit reimbursement from their insurance, and folks who receive that notification and rather than sending their insurance information, send a check.
The green pie is big enough to make me worry that perhaps the letter isn't clear enough to help some of our senior citizens who are very anxious about owing money to anybody at any time understand that the letter does not require them to write a check. So it might be good to review that.
We will, Kathy, we will. Because like you, I was surprised at the percentage. It was not what I expected to see. So we will definitely take a look at the communications that are going out and make sure that they're telling the story that we want them to tell.
And we'll also I will look at it from our side of it with respect to that, because like I said, we get a lot of requests for refunds because both parties have paid. So I'm not sure if the statistical information has kept pace with that. I'm not sure if they go back and actually make an adjustment that wasn't a private pay. So we will talk to them about that as well. Now, Council Member Nastandi had a question with respect to how many calls were coming from the from the actual nursing facilities. At one time, we did have information just about the ones that were in Palm Desert. And I don't want to speak out of turn because I do not remember specifically, but I do recall that it was at least one call a day to the one that was across from the mall, the Atria. And it was at least one call a day from the fire department. Now, I can also tell you that from personal experience recently, what Chief White indicated was actually happened because I had someone who was in one of those facilities, and when they call you to ask you if they want you to transport, they will ask you if this was, they say, we would only transport if this is a 911 call. So it was good to see that that's in action, and it is actually happening because they will ask that question.
Thank you.
And one of the things that we can do as we continue to look at this call data and slice it up in 1,000 different ways is, and the chiefs were literally putting out literal fires this week, so they weren't able to dive into this with me, but we were talking about getting the location coordinates for all of those, for all the calls, and then doing a new heat map that would really show us where they're coming from, where the most calls are coming from. We did that last year with the 2019 data just for the Station 71 area. And we're going to try and get that together for the other stations as well, and with the updated information. Okay, moving on to the numbers. So we're looking at the fire services in a way that's slightly different from the way that we have looked at it in the past. What we are hoping to do today is to provide you with a complete picture of the fire fund. So as you may recall, the city has a special revenue fund, which we just call the fire fund. And that is where revenues go in and expenditures come out for the provision of fire and emergency medical services. So I'm going to kind of walk through this. Absolutely stop me if you have any questions. We continue to fine tune this up until yesterday afternoon with Janet and Luis. And so please feel free to ask any questions that come to your mind. So what I have here in the blue are actuals. This is the actuals for those years taken from year end. And then in the green, our current year, of course, this is our budgeted amount. And then the next year, it's what we're requesting for this year's budget. So our top line is the Fire EMS Cooperative Services Agreement. This is the amount that we pay to Riverside County for those services. The Whitman billing services, as we were just talking about, we employ a third party to bill for EMS services for us, and that is Whitman. The federal quality assurance fee, that's a fee that we have to pay to the state of California related to Medi-Cal and Medicaid patients. It is a complicated bureaucratic layer that we have to pay them, but as part of that, it allows us to get a higher reimbursement for Medicaid patients. So there is some offset there. The contingency fund, that's something that you're used to seeing every year. We have a $50,000 contingency. It pays for, you know, small equipment that may not have been anticipated, various needs that weren't anticipated, and the mini muster, which we hope will return in 2022 bigger and better than ever. So that is what's in that line item. The next line item is something that we haven't typically shown you in this format, which includes all the other fees that go into operating your fire department, which includes admin fees with the county, the utilities for the stations, minor repair and maintenance of the buildings, etc. And we're requesting the same budget for this as we requested last year. A goodly portion of that is utilities, mostly electricity. So the next line item is capital vehicles and capital projects. So in the current year, there's $463,000. Part of that is the squad for Station 71, which you authorized in the previous fiscal year and we purchased this year. And part of that was a study and some initial budget for making modifications to the barracks at Station 71 to squeeze in those 2 extra bodies per shift. That that money has not been spent yet. And in fact, over the course of the year, when our public works team went out, looked at the building, thought about what needed to be done and what kinds of things need to be done to both accommodate the extra staff and make restorations that are necessary for the building to function, there is a budget of $1.2 million for capital improvements in the next year. So that brings our total expenditures to 17.5, thereabouts. The next section of this report is fire fund revenues. So the first line is the structural fire tax, and that is what gets passed through to us.
Hey, Lori,
Oh, I'm sorry, Sabby, yes.
sorry, I was going to wait till you're done with the entire slide, but my question is on the expenditures.
Yes.
I'm looking at a 2-year increase. It goes from, and historically we've been just under $14 million in our expenditures. And now 2 years later, we're at 17.5. You know, it's like a $3.7 million increase, which is super significant, right?
Right.
And I know that part of that is the vehicles, capital projects, which we've approved, but that doesn't account for all of it. I'm just wondering, since our population hasn't increased that much, is there a general reason that expenditures have gone up so significantly in the last 2 years?
Yes, it's the addition of the 4 personnel for the fire for Station 71. So that is the most significant increase in the costs for the contract, is those 4 positions. In the current, they just came on board. So actually, although we budgeted for them for the full year for 2021, at the end of the year, you're going to see that we are not going to spend that much money because they weren't on board the entire year. They were just recently brought on board, but that is the most significant increase. Now, one of the things that we are planning for and part of our consideration with the 4th fire station is that squad is a down payment, if you will, on staffing that station. And so we anticipate that when we do build the next station, that team, that squad and that staff will move to that station and become part of the staffing of that station. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I guess my concern is that on a per capita basis, our expenditures are going up pretty significantly, but I don't know that that's a discussion for today. I'm not sure. I mean, we've heard the requests, we've approved them. And so I guess it is what it is, but it's frankly, for me, kind of a difficult pill to swallow. I understand adding personnel, I understand adding equipment, but in my mind, that should be somewhat consistent with an increase in population. Otherwise, you don't have an increased need for services and for equipment. So I look at it on a per capita basis and I'm thinking, costs are going up pretty significantly. But like I said, I'm not sure that we're going to change that today.
Absolutely.
Just remember you swallowed most of the bill last year.
Yeah, and I don't want to keep doing it every year, but it is what it is, I guess.
I think too, one of the factors for this is that we really delayed the increase in staff probably longer than we should have at 71, or maybe what was optimal, because as we saw last year, we were really overtaxing that station. In preparation for this presentation, I was doing some cursory research on what an average calls are for an ambulance, an average. There were some studies done in California and the LA area that listed 2,600 calls for an ambulance. And as you saw in our earlier slides, our Station 71 ambulance ran 4,600 calls. And so I understand absolutely what you're saying, Sabby, and I agree with you completely. I do think that one of the factors for the significant jump is that we didn't smooth it maybe as well as we could have.
I think that's a really good explanation, and one that is cogent in my mind. And it also looks to the future in my mind and says, okay, now that we've kind of trued up what we're supplying, that we shouldn't be facing these kinds of increases in the future, especially as we look at them on a per capita basis. In other words, we're hopefully where we should have been and where we should be at this point, and shouldn't have significant increases in the future. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but the delta between the revenues and the expenditures is over $5 million. And we're choosing this year to take $4 million out of the general fund and $1 million out of the fire fund. But that fire fund is going down. So if we continue at this pace, it could be that in the future, we won't be taking $4 million out of the general fund. We'll be taking 5 or 6. And, you know, with a $50-some million budget, that's very, very, very significant. So I know we're keeping an eye on it. I just bring up the concerns and my perspective in terms of looking at it, not only in terms of need, which we were persuaded about, but also at the trend on a per capita basis.
Yeah, and Tabby, I think just to kind of reiterate where Lori's going, it's not a 1 or 2x cost when you defer maintenance on these fire stations as fast as these building codes change in California, you know, and you're paying for some of that with the 2 stations. In particular, what's costing us $1 million today, just as an example, probably would have cost us a third of that a few years ago. But every time they start changing these building codes, that cost really hits you hard and it skews these numbers. So we are taking a look at that. We're trying to get these buildings up to par. The direction I've given them is let's look for 10 to 15 year solutions. So we go in there and we're doing them right now, the best, maximizing the dollars. And we are on board with you as well in terms of not only looking what the timing of Station 4 needs to be, but also if there's an ability to rethink where some of these stations are located and you know, sort of draw response time circles around that. We need to look at that. And so we'll be going down both of those paths in the next year before we have the next budget discussion with you. But we couldn't agree more with the trending here between this and what we're seeing on the police side. There's definitely a sense of urgency because it's good, even if it takes 2 or 3 years for our revenues to catch back up, these costs aren't slowing down. So you're right. And we need to look at these things.
Awesome. Thank you.
Lori,
Sorry.
Jan?
if I can ask this, when we have up other, and I assume the 2017-18 is high, there were, and so is 18-19. It drops 19-20. I assume that's repairs and maintenance to the stations that would account for that
Yes.
large difference. Then we're
Yes.
back up to 202. Do we break out when we say utilities? That's that electric, water, gas, cable,
Yes.
Wi-Fi?
Yes.
And I mean, can we break that out a little more? And I know, you know, if we're talking about even moving and we're talking about, or the possibility of it to be more effective. And we're also talking about, unfortunately, doing our best to keep up with the building standards and the increase that causes us. Do we look when we build now to put solar into these, or are we required already? But are we putting things like that into these buildings so that, I mean, that's a significant increase. We're looking at 202 compared to 122.
You're absolutely right. And one of the it's one of the challenges with Station 70. Well, actually with 67 too. It's a smaller station, but it has, you know, single pane light skylights, and we did a few years ago, and Chief White may recall exactly when, undertake some changes at Station 33 to deal with the wall of glass, the west-facing wall of glass that was a significant heat sink for the for the building, we actually drywalled it in, took those windows out and drywalled them in to try and save energy. It's definitely a consideration as we look at the modernization of those stations, is how can we save energy, because we have to keep them cool 24/7. So we'll definitely be looking at that, and solar as a way to generate power as well.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And Kathleen, did you have something you wanted to add or ask? No? Okay. So stepping through the revenues, we have, as I was saying, the structural fire tax, which is the pass through from property tax. It's a pretty stable revenue source. As you can see, it has gone up about $500,000. But if you do the math, this is the 2% Prop 13 property tax increase every year. That's what you're seeing there. And then the Prop A fire tax is the City of Palm Desert's structural fire tax, or the City of Palm Desert's tax that is levied on parcels for fire and emergency services. And that is, I have it footnoted on your next slide, but that is $60. It's set at $60 per residential unit. It has a varying cost for commercial units that is its ceiling. As it is written today, it could only be changed by taking it back to the voters. But I think that was one of the things we saw in Janet's information, or something that Luis was showing, that the cities of La Quinta and some of our other cities may have different amounts that they charge. The city of Rancho Mirage has a CFD, that sort of thing. But in Palm Desert, we have that $60 per parcel tax. And then the next line there you see is the EMS cost recovery, which we were talking about earlier. So we started that program in October of 2018. So this was the first year, 18-19. 19-20, we received nearly $3 million in cost recovery through that program. In this year, 2021, we know that there was a reduction in calls. We haven't seen how that's all shaken out yet, but we are anticipating a lower revenue because there were a lower number of medical calls for service. And then for 21-22, we're estimating $2.3 million in revenue. Of course, we'll monitor that, and if an adjustment is appropriate mid-year, we'll bring that back to the council. If calls for service increase, if the reimbursements increase, we'll let you know. The next line is the reimbursement for the ladder truck. The ladder truck is a shared resource with the other Cove cities, Indian Wells and Rancho Mirage. Excuse me. And so they reimburse us on a proportional share for that resource. It is housed here in Palm Desert at Station 33. And then this next line is miscellaneous fees that the city receives in from permits, firework permits. So like fire sprinkler permits, expansions that required a fire review, fireworks, etc., and then a small amount of interest on the fire fund. But you'll notice that there was a big difference between 1920 and 2021. And that has to do with our decision to no longer contract with the county to provide in-house fire marshal services. One of the things that they did while they were here is they collected fees and passed those fees through to us because we were paying for their services. And when they removed themselves from our organization, they collected those fees directly themselves. This is something that in this year we'll be taking a closer look at to make sure, number one, that the city is collecting the fees that are appropriate for the city, and the county is collecting the fees that are appropriate for the county. And also the city manager has tasked us with, evaluating, are there any services that would be appropriate from the fire marshal's office to make sure that our development community and our residents are getting the best, most efficient service that they can get. And so we'll continue to look at that as we go through the year. There were also a couple, I went through the permits, and in 18-19 and 19-20, I think you'll recall there were some large multifamily units that were approved in those years. And so there were a few $1,000s in permits from those. So that's our revenue. Go ahead.
Lori, I'm just curious, the Prop A fire tax is a parcel tax. How could it go down how could it go down? It was 2.7 million in 1819. I mean, we don't have less parcels.
I think it might be the commercial, because commercial is not per parcel. The commercial is on a different formula, but I'm gonna punt to Janet.
I think Lori's made the correct assumption is on the commercial side of things. If we remember when things kind of, I don't want to say they fell apart in 1920, but when COVID hit, the commercial properties were going for less than the regular residential. And by that, I mean, remember too, that this is 2 years behind. The county's information based on their assessed values, they are 2 years behind, and we usually don't see the impact of what happens. So it could be an anomaly. What I can go back and look at, I can look at 1819 and see what it was actually that was collected for that year, and see if there's anything there that would estimate that. Because if you look at 1718, you see 2.2, and then in 1920 it goes to 2.3, which is more realistic. So it's very possible that there's something in 1819 that maybe is, like I said, an anomaly, or maybe they caught up, or maybe there's something like that. But I'll take a look
Janet,
at that.
are you saying that commercial is not a flat fee per parcel, but is somehow based on assessed value?
It's based on, I believe it's based on assessed value. I'll have to go back and look and see how it's calculated, but yes.
Okay. I just think maybe that the takeaway is just to ensure that we're not, and I don't think our city has ever done it, but other cities have been guilty of failing to adequately bill and have lost potential revenue. I doubt that's what's happening here, but you never know. So maybe it bears looking at.
We'll go back and we'll take a look at it.
Thank you.
And just something, as long as I'm looking at this, one of the things Lori and I worked on with this slide is the challenges between actual and estimated. And that also accounts for some of those big changes between the 1920 year and the 2021 year. The reason I say that is because we also have to remember that over the last 3 years, the fire department has had a fairly I don't want to say sizable, but they've had a vacancy rate in their employees. So we budget with the anticipation that they're fully staffed, but there's oftentimes where they are not fully staffed. And so they may have one employee that maybe puts in overtime, and I'm sure the chiefs could go into this more in detail, but that often is less expensive than another person. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that person isn't needed. It's just that position is not filled. So we know that was the case at one point, and we know that for a fact, but we do budget with the anticipation they will be fully staffed. So I do not anticipate actually in the 2021 year, now based on what I know with respect to when they filled the Squad 71, that we're going to be at 15-1, but we're not sure exactly based on the overtime and the information. Again, the county is very far behind in billing us. They bill quarterly, and they're quarters behind. I believe that we've paid through the second quarter. So, we get behind as far as payment, or they get behind as far as billing, and I think our final bill usually comes in sometime in August or September. So we're estimating, but again, all that would do is just lessen the amount that would be transferred from the general fund. Maybe we didn't need it, or maybe we make the recommendation that we still transfer that amount if we have extraordinary revenues, so that we can plan for ultimate costs at our force station.
I think that pretty much brings us down to the fire fund balance. So we have the transfer in from the general fund, which is what we anticipate to transfer based upon everything that Janet just said, and the fire fund balance for those 3 years. That's the actual balance. This 2021 and 21-22 are of course estimated based upon us taking the actions that we have just talked about. And then this last row here for your information, again, with this idea of keeping everything in one place so that you can see everything that's happening with your fire department and your fire services, is the Fire Facilities Restoration Fund, which is again a special revenue fund. And this is the developer impact fees that have been and are being collected specifically for the construction of another fire station based upon nexus studies for its need, based upon development in the northern area of our city. And so that is currently estimated to be at about $1.2 million, and will grow as we collect fees as things get built.
Or there's nothing entered for 21, 22. That doesn't signify zero. It's not.
No, we just
Okay.
didn't make we just didn't speculate out. This Luis Espinosa did me the great service of estimating it for this year, but we didn't estimate it out for next year. I know I did speak with Eric, and I have a narrative report from him on the great number of developments that are kicking into higher gear in the North Sphere. So, which is good, which is great for all, for everyone concerned, and will definitely lead to increases in this fund and also other areas as well.
Yeah, and I'll just mention, you brought up a timing issue that relates to both the new fire station, police station, regional park. We've always tried to match the chicken to the egg. And I think we might be getting a little behind the developers now. So I just say, in terms of, budgeting and moving forward with some of these large scale projects that we've just held off because the North Sphere was not being developed, it may be time to kick some of those into higher gear.
Absolutely.
And I will tell you that fire facilities restoration fee and that fund is charged to developers of certain geographic locations. It is not across the city. It is only in that, and it is mainly in the north area.
Okay. That's all I have to present. I did add another slide for you that has the footnotes it's the same information, but it just has all the footnotes. And in order to make it easier for us to go over and see today, I did this slide that had just the numbers. So I don't have any other information to share. If you don't have any questions about any of the slides I presented, I'll stop sharing this screen. I did receive I'm of course happy to answer any questions. The chiefs are here to answer any questions that you may have. And also Matt Martello joined the call. He was watching previously on YouTube. So when you were asking for him, he couldn't reach out to you, but he is in the audience if you wanted to go back and ask him anything.
Sure, if Matt has a thought to share about why some cities are up in aggravated assaults and others down, that would be great to hear. Here he comes.
I can share
Hi,
that
Mayor
slide
Kelly.
again.
Hi, thank you. I was getting invited when you were asking the question, so I didn't hear the whole question. Oh,
So, Matt,
yeah.
hi.
Hi.
We looked at a slide that shows between 2018 and 2019, which I guess is the most recent data we have, but it's already a little old. But between 2018 and 2019, Palm Desert, La Quinta, Indio, Rancho Mirage, Indian Wells, all show a jump in violent crime, which Stephen said was predominantly aggravated assaults. Two cities went down, Desert Hot Springs and Cathedral City. So I was just interested to hear if, given everything you see, you have a story to tell about what might have been happening.
Well, just looking at the numbers here, I can't be specific, but I can tell you that the sheriff's department and your deputies, they diligently take reports at every call for service. And I can't speak for other cities that are in the community, but I know when we're out in the field, we document all crime within our city. So and at that time, 18 and 19, we do probably see an increase of maybe some domestics as well as some other, particularly in Palm Desert. We had some transient related crimes too that were just transient on transient, but nothing to spike that I could think of offhand. But for the most part, the city of Palm Desert, the deputies here, we do take every call for service and we do document it.
Steve, could you show the slide you had that showed the ratio, per capita? That one, I think that probably could be commented on.
Sure.
Thank you.
We're talking for violent crime, correct? Not property related? Okay.
Yeah, that'd be violent. Yeah, sure. That could include domestic and everything as well. Domestic violence, that's included in there, as well as just simple assault and other crimes related to it.
So is this per thousand? Is that how are we looking at this?
It's per thousand.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
No, you're welcome.
Okay. And just if I could go back just very briefly to one of the questions Councilmember Jonathan asked about that 1 year that had kind of a spike on the Prop A fire tax. Actually, in looking at that, I just kind of went through. That's one thing about Zoom meetings is I have access to all of that. I did actually go backwards, and believe it or not, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's the elimination of RDA. What happened is we sold some properties, and so they divvied up the excess revenue from those payments when we sold those properties, and some of it did go to the fire. Went to the fire fund, and it went into that account. It might have been more appropriate to go somewhere else, but it was related to that. So that's the jump. We won't see that until we sell a bunch of properties again at the same time.
Thank you, Jenny. Can we give them the money back and get RDA back?
I'm not sure that anybody can hurdle that.
Is Governor Newsom here to be elevated?
He did mention he had a whole lot of extra money laying around. Perhaps that would be
if we could elevate him here to the participant list, we'd ask him about that.
Mayor
Okay.
Kelly, as a follow-up to your question, I did look at the FBI stats right now on their website. And in those two cities, Cathedral City and Desert Hot Springs, they showed a sharp decline in aggravated assaults that year. So it was the opposite effect of what we're seeing in the other cities.
Right. So it's a mystery for now. All right, Janet, what more do we have for our entertainment?
Okay, well, actually, what I was going to tell you is that is it for the presentation of the budget. We have covered almost all of the general fund. We have talked about other funds. We have talked about police and fire, and that concludes pretty much our presentation. One thing I will tell you is we did increase the miscellaneous sponsorships in the event budget from 25 to 50,000 since our last meeting. And also we do have a couple of things that I've noted as follow-ups. I know Stephen's been making some notes. None of those really impact the dollars that are going to be presented with the budget. So what we'd like to do is, I think Lori had a great suggestion that we would probably add some of those statistics into the Friday report. And I don't see anything that would be something that you would that we would need to present at the next meeting. So the next meeting, as has been in the past, we will present you with what we call a very summarized version of the detail that you have. If you need more detail, or if you have it via email and you'd like a printed version or anything like that, you're welcome to reach out to us. We'll make sure we get that for you. And then the next time you'll have to listen to me for at least a few sentences is going to be on the 24th. So with that, I open it up to the council to ask us any other questions that you might have on the budget as a whole. And if there are none, that's fine. Then as Todd has kind of started saying to the rest of us, he's going to give us time back if we end a meeting early. So I'm going to throw that out to you and offer up this opportunity to ask any questions.
We weren't shy as we went along, so I think we're good. Everybody's nodding.
Yes, thank you, Mayor.
And
And Janet.
we got a great summary from Thomas on the event, so I think that's been covered.
Okay.
Mayor, I just briefly want to thank our finance department and Lori and Stephen and everybody else that gets into the the fire budget, the police budget, so into the weeds. And then I got to tell you, it's just so reassuring to know that we have such an excellent finance department, because that is such an important issue, of course, the management of our resources. So thank you so much for all your hard work. And Todd, Janet, I think mentioned the Friday report. If I mentioned how much I love that report, thank you for that as well.
Well, you stole my concluding words, so I won't repeat them. Way to go.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much. We appreciate it.
Great job, team.
Hi, Louise. Hi, Clayton.